A land of forest, tundra and steppe, it straddles 2 continents and 11 time zones. Throughout history, its people have suffered under waves of invasions from both east and west, and from tyrants within their own borders. And despite this, they have kept a national identity intact that is neither European nor Asian, but their own, expressed through writers, musicians, scientists and engineers that have rivaled those of any other power in quality and global influence. It has been a player in the geopolitics of both continents for centuries, and after the world's greatest experiment in socio-engineering, it became a global superpower. Today, after recovering from the ultimately failed project, it still punches above its demographic and economic weight in international affairs. This is a nation of so many global superlatives, but let's just settle on the one most well known. This is the world's largest country. This could only be Russia. Russia, the world's largest country by land area, is home to the Russian people as well as a myriad of other peoples across its vast geography. Straddling 2 continents, it dominates both in terms of size, forming the eastern half of Europe and the northern half of Asia. It has a history of rising from relative obscurity to becoming a global player on the world stage. How it made that journey is one of the most remarkable of all nations, and I will now attempt to do the impossible and cover it in just 20 minutes. Following this, I will look at the land itself, the country's economy, and lastly, the unique culture of its people that has had such a lasting global impact. The forests and steppes of Eastern Europe and Northern Asia have been occupied by humans for tens of thousands of years. It has been theorized, in fact, that the origin of all Indo-European language-speaking peoples was in a region between and north of the Black and Caspian Seas, and that these peoples moved outwards from here into Europe, the Middle East, and India. Written records from Roman and Greek antiquity are not definitive, since this area was constantly changing in terms of nomadic tribes, and they only concerned the area around the Black Sea. The northern part of European Russia was essentially unknown to written sources. At some point between the 5th and 7th centuries AD, Eastern Slavic people that went on to form the core of the Russian, Ukrainian and Belarusian peoples are believed by some to have migrated out from the area of the Pripyat marshes which lie on the border of modern-day Belarus and Ukraine. A more definitive record emerges around the 9th century as Viking traders and explorers made their way east from Sweden in their longboats, sailing down the extensive rivers of European Russia. Although controversial for many centuries, the historical census today is that these Varangians, as the Vikings are known in the east, became the rulers of this region in what is known as the Kievan Rus. The word Russia derives from these people, and the core word itself can be traced back to the Old Eastern Norse word rods, meaning the men who row, a reference to their dominance through longboats, a word still used more or less today by the Finnish and Estonians to describe Sweden. The Rus ruled for about 4 centuries, and while they would have been culturally distinct from their Eastern Slavic subjects at the beginning, were soon absorbed by the locals and were positively Slavic in the latter centuries. It was during this time that Christianity came to the area in the form of the Rus, returning from raids on Orthodox Christian Constantinople to the south, and Byzantine missionaries, the most well-known of these being the brothers Saint Cyril and Methodius, who first gave these peoples an alphabet. More on that alphabet later. Orthodox Christianity was officially adopted as the state religion in 988 AD, a decision that would shape much of Russian culture all the way through to the present day. The rule of the Rus came to a sudden and brutal end in the late 13th century as the Mongol horde raced across the steppes from the east. All of southern European Russia would be under the Mongol heel for the next 2.5 centuries, but in the north, the old Rus capital of Novgorod survived, yet this was soon eclipsed by the foundation and subsequent growth of Moscow. By the middle of the 1500s, Muscovy, as it was then known, had consolidated its power to become the dominant force in European Russia. Under Ivan the Terrible, the first ruler of Muscovy to declare himself Tsar of all Russia, the state developed into an autocracy, meaning that the king, known as the Tsar, ruled absolutely, with the nobility very much subjugated to his rule, not to mention the peasantry. This differed from most European monarchies at the time, where the king really ruled with the blessing or approval of the nobility. The word Tsar itself actually derives from Caesar in Latin, since after the fall of the Byzantine capital of Constantinople in 1453, the rulers of Moscow considered themselves as the spiritual successors of Rome. It was in the following century that the exploration and conquest of the vast lands to the east by Moscow would occur. Driven by the demand for furs throughout Europe, trappers and hunters moved into the forbidding boreal forest, returning with maps that were then used as part of a concerted drive by the state to claim these areas for the crown. By the end of the 1600s, they had defeated all the tribes and nomadic khanates along the way and reached the far Pacific coast. Thousands of miles from the capital far to the west, this epic campaign made Russia the largest country in the world at that time, a title it has retained ever since. The Romanov dynasty of Tsars began in the early 1600s and would rule Russia essentially unopposed for the next 3 centuries. The first of the notable Romanov Tsars was Peter the Great, who, at the end of the 17th century, realized how backward Russia was in terms of its development compared with Europe and wanted to model the country more upon that continent's traditions. After defeating Sweden in a coalition during the Great Northern War, Russia gained territory in the northern Baltic and, needing access to the sea, ordered the building of a city on the coast there in 1703. Much of St. Petersburg's architecture was built in the French style, since Peter was looking to emulate and follow the West. He moved the Russian capital here from Moscow as he saw it as his window opened to Europe. In the 18th century, the Russian state, as it pushed south into the relatively sparsely populated steppe between and north of the Caspian and Black Seas, encountered the Cossacks, an independent group of mixed ethnic but predominantly East Slavic communities that centered around a strong military tradition. At times the Russians and Cossacks fought each other, in other times they were allied. Ultimately, Cossack units became elite parts of the Russian army until the 20th century and were greatly feared in battle for their military prowess. The last decades of the 18th century saw another influential Tsar, or rather Tsarina, in the form of Catherine the Great. During her reign, she broke the power of the once mighty Commonwealth of Poland-Lithuania, leading to its partition with Prussia and Austria and the disappearance of those states until 1918. Under her rule, Russia also continued Peter's advances south into the Caucasus and in 1783 seized the Crimea, hitherto a vassal state of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. As Napoleon Bonaparte set light to Europe in war at the end of that century, Russia switched sides a number of times, but in the end turned against the French revolutionary turned emperor. In 1814, Napoleon invaded Russia with almost 500,000 men. Less than a year later, after the brutal Russian winter decimated troops unused to the cold, and with a scorched earth policy by the Russians denying the advancing troops any sustenance, Bonaparte retreated the long distance back from Moscow to Paris, with almost 9 of every 10 soldiers that set out dead. It was Napoleon's greatest failure and effectively meant the end of his rule and the costly wars that had devastated Europe. As the 19th century progressed, Russia continued its expansion into the Caucasus and began new campaigns in Central Asia, which over the course of that century would advance its territory all the way to the borders of Persia and Afghanistan. Far to the east, explorers and trappers had already crossed the Bering Strait separating Asia from North America more than a century earlier, and the empire had claimed Alaska. Fearing that the British would seize this territory, it was sold to the United States in 1867 for the princely sum of $7.2 million. Only Russia, out of all the countries in Europe, still had a peasantry tied to the lands of their lords, that is, serfdom. Within the context of a rapidly growing population, the calls for reform and threat of revolution could not be ignored. At last, in 1861, Tsar Alexander II issued the Edict of Emancipation. A key effect of this was for many of the rural poor to flock to the cities. Many of these enhanced their status by creating businesses and becoming wealthy subjects in a growing middle-class intelligentsia, while most remained poor, working long hours in factories as the country industrialized. Both sectors became threats to the continued unpopular autocratic rule of the Tsars. But it was a disastrous foreign war that was the first spark to trigger revolution. In 1905, the Russian naval fleet was humiliated in a crushing defeat by Japan at the Tsushima Straits, the first time a Western power had been beaten in a major battle by one from Asia. The revolution of 1905 followed, and Tsar Nicholas II made the concession of introducing a Duma, or parliament, and extending the right of the people to vote for deputies to this chamber. This diffused the tension for now, but the events of 1917 that would forever change the world were now only 12 short years away. It took a full-scale industrialized war to bring an end to Romanov rule and the great socialist experiment that would follow. In 1914, Russia came to the aid of their pan-Slavic brothers in Serbia, who were attacked by the Austro-Hungarian Empire following the assassination of their heir, Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo. With the interlocking system of alliances in place, Europe soon became embroiled in a full-scale war, with Russia being joined by Britain and France against Germany, Turkey, and the attackers of Serbia. The war went very badly for Russia, whose troops outnumbered Germany and Austria together, but who were so poorly equipped that many were sent to the front with no arms and told to pick up whatever weapons they could on the way. Made worse was Tsar Nicholas taking direct command of the army, yet not listening to military advisors but rather the musings of his wife, who was now in thrall to her holy man, the famed Grigory Rasputin. As the war continued, the situation in the cities became desperate, with food shortages now common. It was in this context that the factory workers of Petrograd, the renamed capital of St. Petersburg, went on strike in February of 1917. When the strikers and demonstrators were shot by troops, much of the capital rose up in violence. The first of the two Russian revolutions of 1917 had begun, and within 2 weeks, the Tsar had abdicated, ending centuries of Romanov rule. A provisional government filled the vacuum headed by a succession of figures appointed by the Duma, but their rule was weak and ineffective, with infighting among the many political factions. Worse, the government had decided to continue the war despite the army being clearly outmatched by the enemy. social unrest regularly boiled over into street protests that were often suppressed with gunfire from the authorities. This fragile situation was seized by a relatively small faction of hardline socialists known as the Bolsheviks. Knowing that they wanted to see an end to the war, Germany financed many of their activities and provided for a secret sealed train to allow their leader, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known as Lenin, to travel from his exile in Switzerland back to the Russian capital. With their armed supporters seizing key supply points within the capital and arresting members of the government in the Winter Palace, the October Revolution was over in a couple of days. In cities across Russia, workers' councils, or Soviets, likewise seized local government buildings supporting the Bolshevik takeover. The Romanovs that did not already flee were all executed in 1918, including the former Tsar himself. It took another 4 years for the Bolsheviks to complete their takeover of the country. In that time they had signed a peace treaty with Germany, who within a year themselves had been defeated by the Western powers. The Russian Civil War, in which the Bolsheviks fought with other more moderate socialists and the Western-backed anti-communist White movement, was, like any civil war, extremely brutal. This, on top of 3 years of war before 1917, meant that by the end of these events, Russia had been in a state of turmoil for almost 9 years. Millions were dead from war, massacres, famine, and disease. It was not a good time to be alive and be Russian. Millions escaped to the West, including the majority of the educated middle class, along with many skilled workers. As a result of the wars, territories in the West, including Finland, the Baltic states, and Poland, were lost, but with these exceptions, at the time of the Soviet Union's inception in 1922, the borders were more or less restored to those of the Russian Empire prior to 1914. Russia was only one part of the Soviet Union, with Ukraine, the Caucasus, and the Central Asian states being a part of this union which had started in Russia and was enforced upon them by Russian communists. The new state was an embodiment of the Communist Manifesto, as envisioned by German political philosopher Karl Marx in 1848. With modifications by Lenin, this became the official policy of the state, referred to as Marxism-Leninism, up until the ending of that system in 1991. Its central tenet was that all property and produce was collectively owned by the people, but in reality this meant the state. No political opposition was permitted, religion was effectively outlawed, there was no free market, no privately owned businesses, food, manufactured goods, and even one's own apartment were managed by the state, with prices set based upon committee. It was, in short, the greatest social engineering experiment in world history. How it ended, I shall cover in a moment. But domestic and international events continued center stage. Within 2 years of the founding of the Soviet Union, Lenin was dead from a series of strokes. The successor who wormed his way to power was Joseph Stalin, who, during his 30-year tenure, probably caused the death of more of his own people than any other ruler save China's Mao. Most likely a paranoid schizophrenic, he continually suspected anyone of threatening to overthrow him, from close advisors to military officers, or indeed anyone who voiced any kind of political dissent against the Communist Party. Those who were not summarily shot were sent to the Gulag, hard labor camps in Siberia and other remote areas where very few returned alive. Millions more died of famine in the attempts to collectivize agriculture in the early 1930s. If there is anything redeeming to be said of Stalin, it's that he successfully repelled the Nazi German invasion of the Soviet Union, which began in 1941 and ended with the total defeat of the Nazis in 1945. The human cost to the Soviet Union was staggeringly high, with at least 20 million dead, and the economy set back by a quarter century as a result of the inflicted devastation. It has been said that all the effort of the Allies, that being Britain, the United States, and all those free French, Polish, Dutch, Belgians, Danes, and Norwegians that fought on their side, counted ultimately for nothing in regard to the defeat of the Nazis, because the Soviet Union could have defeated Germany all on its own. But then, had the Allies not committed to the D-Day landings in Normandy and pushed the enemy back into Germany, the post-war map would have likely been very different. For after the war, with Soviet troops having advanced all the way into Eastern Germany and much of the Balkans, those countries came under the sway of the Soviet Union, becoming its effective satellite states, in which any opposition to local communist parties was crushed, as demonstrated by Soviet tanks moving into Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. Stalin finally died in 1953, ending his reign of terror, and the quality of life improved for the average Russian. Industrial production was high, and according to global indices of the time, the Soviet Union was the world's second largest economy after the United States. Russia, in combination with its satellites, had become a superpower, and with its economic and philosophical system diametrically opposed to the free market capitalist United States, within just 2 years of the ending of World War II, a new Cold War had begun, in which no bullets flew directly between the two states, but in which many proxy wars were fought, first in Korea and then Vietnam. Atomic and later thermonuclear arsenals of bombs and missiles were stockpiled by the opposing forces, with any crisis threatening to spill over into nuclear war. This reached its height during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when it is said that civilization was closest to complete annihilation than at any time in its history. A clandestine war of spies, sleeper agents, assassinations, and the stealing of military secrets also continued during this time, with the Soviets' KGB being perhaps the most determined and skilled spy agency in history. But the competition to prove who had the best system was also conducted in more peaceful ways, such as in the promotion of sports, in which the Soviet Union consistently performed at the top or second of the medal tables in the Olympics and in the space race. Perhaps Russia's greatest historical achievement is that they were the first to put an object, and then a dog, then a man, and finally a woman, into orbit around our planet. A succession of leaders followed Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, increasingly old men from the early days of the Soviet Union, unwilling to relinquish power to the next generation, but Russian communism was already atrophying from the inside out. The economy was stagnating in comparison to the Free West, with corruption within the Communist Party hierarchy pervasive, and where a lack of access to quality housing, decent cars and consumer goods, empty shelves and long queues made life in the Soviet Union a comparatively joyless place. And if you wanted to leave, well, that wasn't going to happen. You needed an exit visa for permission to visit countries outside, and they were almost never given to countries outside the Eastern Bloc. That said, many of the older generation living in Russia today lament the more uncertain times of the present and look back on the days of communism with nostalgia. You were guaranteed a house and a job. There was stability, no crime, they say. Such support is reflected in the Communist Party of Russia today still getting significant numbers of votes in elections to the State Duma. When finally the leadership was passed to a younger man, Mikhail Gorbachev, in 1985, he attempted to institute the reforms of Glasnost and Perestroika, but it was already too late. The whole system was ready for collapse, and the trigger came from those states that Stalin had effectively occupied in 1945. In 1918, the Berlin Wall came down, and within 2 years the Soviet Union had ended, with Gorbachev effectively ousted by the Russian Soviet Republic President Boris Yeltsin. The Soviet Union was dissolved in 1991, with the various constituent republics becoming independent states. Russia became just Russia once again, but with its borders reduced to the pre-imperial days of the 1700s. The economy, after 70 years of state control, was not prepared for an immediate switch to free market capitalism, which ensued under Yeltsin's rule. Hyperinflation hit the ruble as living standards for ordinary Russians plunged in a crisis that is considered to be worse even than that of 1920s Germany or the Great Depression of 1930s United States. Vast assets of the state, such as public utilities, oil, gas, and mining concerns, were sold off at mere kopecks on the ruble to opportunistic semi-criminals known as oligarchs who later became fabulously rich. The vast majority suffered, with many on the street selling anything they could just to get a meal. The economy shrank into insignificance on the global rankings. The effect of this economic chaos threatened to spread to political anarchy, and the upshot was that after a constitutional crisis and an attempted coup by hardline communists in the Duma in 1993, Yeltsin shelled the parliament building, and in desperation the parliament gave him extensive powers to rule by decree. Just like in those few months of representative democracy in 1917, so too did another attempt at sharing power with the parliament also effectively end with the return of a strong man ruling Russia. Yeltsin resigned at the end of the millennium on December 31st, 1999, announcing his successor, his protege, the then relatively unknown figure, Vladimir Putin. In the last 2 decades, Putin has held office as president for most of that time, and when he has not officially held the post, has been the country's de facto ruler. He has remained very popular among Russians, since many credit him with bringing stability and dealing with the semi-criminal organized crime oligarchs that had taken over much of local power structures and economy during the troubled 1990s. The United Russia Party that advocates his policies has dominated elections to the Duma throughout this time under a banner of what is regarded as new Russian conservatism. The free market is allowed to operate generally without limits in a way comparable to most nations today, and after the chaos following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the general standard of living for most Russians, especially in the cities, has risen considerably to the point where most would argue today that they are better off than they were under the communist system, with consumer goods and electronics available for most, and food plentiful and affordable. But state control still dominates in the old Russian way, with the legal system considered by many to be arbitrary, and where genuine political opposition is threatened or intimidated, and religious minorities often targeted. These issues of concern are manifested in the latest Human Freedom Index of the Cato Institute, which shows a rather poor score for personal freedom, while economic freedom is about mid-table. On the international stage, while Russia is no longer the superpower that it once was during the Cold War, it is nonetheless still a player at the top table in geopolitics due to its geographic reach across 2 continents, its permanent seat on the UN Security Council, having the world's largest nuclear arsenal, and the world's second most powerful military after the United States. The official name of the country is the Russian Federation, and this gives us a clue that Russia has a federal structure in terms of how powers are distributed across the many regions within this vast country. This overall structure was put into place in 1993 in the new post-Soviet Russian constitution, which has been refined at various times since. The head of state is the president, who represents the country abroad, as well as directing broad policy within the country. He or she is elected by direct vote of the people for a 6-year term. Execution of national and foreign policy is determined by the federal government, headed by a chairman equivalent to a prime minister, who is chosen by the president and confirmed by a vote of the State Duma. The Duma is the lower of 2 national parliamentary houses, in which 450 deputies are elected for 5-year terms through proportional representation of the populace. The numerous regions of Russia are represented by such regions' own parliaments, returning 2 senators each to this upper house, the 170-member Federation Council. The status of the 85 federal subjects, as these regions are known, is somewhat complex due to inherited historical factors. The most common types are the 46 oblasts, a word which basically translates into English as province or region. Legally identical to oblasts are the 9 krais, whose titles are simply kept for historical reasons. The 22 republics have much more autonomy than oblasts and krais, and are more or less self-governing. They are given this status since they are home to ethnic minorities that are either significant or dominant within that region. 13 of the 22 have ethnic Russians in the minority. Then there are the 3 federal cities of Moscow, St. Petersburg and Sevastopol, which operate independently of any region. Lastly, there are the 4 autonomous okrugs or districts that may or may not be subservient to an oblast, and the Jewish Autonomous Oblast, which ironically now has only about 1% of the population practicing Judaism. So as I was saying, the regional picture of Russian administration is filled with quirks and historical hangovers. The flag of Russia is a well-known horizontal tricolor of white, blue and red. It first appeared in the late 17th century and has been in use ever since, except during the reign of Tsar Alexander II and again during the Soviet Union era. At the time of its inception, the colors represented in order of priority white for God, blue for king, and red for the people or nation. The coat of arms of Russia is based on a design that evolved during the early Tsardom of Muscovy. It is dominated by the two-headed eagle, adopted by the early Russian Tsars from the Byzantine Empire, with one bird looking west and the other east to represent the two divisions of the Roman Empire after 300 AD, now aptly repurposed to this country straddling two continents, with an eagle looking to each. The imperial crowns represent the unity and sovereignty of the Russian state, while the orb and scepter represent traditional heraldic sovereign power and authority. The central shield is that of the dragon being slain by St. George, the patron saint of Moscow and later by extension Russia. The geography of Russia is unique in that it is the only country in the world to extensively span two continents, that of Europe and Asia. As pretty much everyone knows, it is the largest country by land area at over 16 million square kilometers, almost twice as large as the next three largest of Canada, China and the United States. The division between the European and Asian continents is, of course, arbitrary, since really both are technically just a single continent of Eurasia. That subdivision is universally regarded as being at the Urals, a long line of mountains running from the Arctic North down to the steppes of Kazakhstan about 1400 kilometers east of Moscow. West of here is generally referred to as European Russia, while east of here is considered to be Siberia, although that is a very general term, as the Kamchatka Peninsula in the Far East is regarded as having its own identity, as does also the Pacific coastal region of Amur around and to the north of the strategic port of Vladivostok. In terms of topography, Russia is incredibly flat, with perhaps only Australia being of comparison in this regard for a large country. With the exception of the Urals and upland areas in eastern Siberia and Kamchatka, there are no significant mountain chains within the body of the country. The Caucasus Mountains flank the southern border between the Black and Caspian Seas, while the Altai Mountains form much of the border with Mongolia. But the wide open plains between the heartlands around Moscow and Europe and Central Asia have left Russia vulnerable to invasions from east and west, as history has shown. Conversely, this has also meant that Russia has been able to easily extend its influence, and indeed borders, beyond its Russian-speaking heartland in the past. Today, the countries that border on this giant nation are numerous. Starting in the west, there is a short border with Norway, then the long border with Finland, and then the short coast along the Gulf of Bothnia in the Baltic, with the second city of St. Petersburg as the major port there. South of here is the border with Estonia and then Latvia, and on the other side of Lithuania, the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, once Königsberg of German East Prussia. Continuing south and east, the long border with Belarus then turns into the long and contentious border with the Ukraine. This border ends in the Sea of Azov that connects with the Black Sea, and beyond this, the Crimea, which returned to Russia from the Ukraine against international opposition in 2014. The Russian coast with the Black Sea extends down to the beginning of the Caucasus Mountains near Sochi, and then along those mountains bordering Georgia, and then Azerbaijan before ending in the Caspian Sea. Following this inland sea coast north, we then meet the long border with Kazakhstan, which extends for thousands of kilometers along the Central Asian steppe before meeting with a short border with China, then the entire northern border with Mongolia. At the eastern end of this, the main border with China and its provinces of Manchuria are formed, going east and then south before meeting with a short border with North Korea, just southwest of the Pacific port of Vladivostok. A sea border separates Russia from Japan, just south of Sakhalin Island, and then again with the southern Kuril Islands, which Japan also claims. The large Sea of Okhotsk is enclosed by the Pacific coast of Siberia and inner coast of the Kamchatka Peninsula, while the outer coast faces the Pacific directly. At the extreme eastern end of Russia, we find the Bering Strait and the sea border with the United States in Alaska. The entire north of the country is bordered by the Arctic Ocean, which also feature numerous bleak offshore islands owned by the country. Taking up so much of the Eurasian continent, it's no surprise that Russia is home to 5 of the world's 20 longest rivers. The Yenisei, Ob, and Lena rivers drain the vast plains of Siberia and flow north into the Arctic, while the Amur empties into the Pacific. The Volga, Russia's most important river economically, empties into the Caspian Sea. All these rivers freeze over for most or all of their length in winter. Russia is truly vast, so any long-distance journeys by sensible people are made by air. However, to continue the tradition of this series, we'll look at journeys by road. To go from the most northern to southern points at the widest section along the longitude of Moscow, the 4,000-kilometer road journey would take approximately 46 hours or about 6 days if you're traveling 8 hours a day. If you want to travel from the western to eastern part of the country, you can't. There are no roads connecting the far eastern part of Siberia or Kamchatka. If you're still mad enough to want to get in your car and drive from St. Petersburg to Magadan along the Siberian coast with the Sea of Okhotsk, then be prepared for a 10,511-kilometer journey. If driven 8 hours each day, would still take you 2.5 weeks. But why are we talking about roads when Russia has the longest timetabled and perhaps most famous railway service in the world? I am of course referring to the Trans-Siberian Railway, built between 1891 and 1916, running from Moscow to Vladivostok on the Pacific coast. It has a length of over 9,000 kilometers, spans 8 time zones, and takes about a week to complete. Despite its size, Russia is more uniform in terms of climate than you might think. With few parts of the country close to warm, moderating oceans, continental climate types of the Köppen D class dominate. The lower half of the country has the warm A and B classic continental climates, with the DFB specific warm summer, cold winter variant with rain or snow year-round encompassing most of the population that inhabits European Russia. This zone extends far into southern Siberia and is actually one of the longest contiguous climate zones in the world. Within this zone, however, in travelling west to east, the winters become gradually colder and in general the climate becomes drier. The far Pacific coast has this climate, while a bit inland, the Asian monsoon influences such that winters are mostly dry while summers are wet. This is the DWB continental monsoon variant. Southern European Russia sees hot summers instead of warm, and so here we have the DFA variant. East of here the climate is dry enough to be classified as semi-arid, while in the southernmost part of this region along and near the Black Sea, oceanic and humid subtropical climates exist. Most of the country, however, has the subarctic continental climate, specifically the very cold winter, warm summer variant of year-round precipitation known as DFC. In the southeast, north of Mongolia and China, the Asian monsoon influences this climate to produce dry winters and wet summers. In northeastern Siberia, the winters are even more extreme, and here we have the DFD and DWD Köppen variants, with winter day-night averages typically at minus 50 Celsius, despite summers still staying warm and above 20 Celsius. This climate, which has the highest seasonal temperature ranges in the world, is unique to Russia, and the town of Verkhoyansk, in this pole of cold, has the world record for the most extreme seasonal temperature ranges. Along the Arctic coast and upland regions of northeast Siberia, summer temperatures are unable to rise above 10 Celsius, and so tree growth is not possible. This leads to tundra conditions and consequently a polar ET Köppen code of the same name as the biome. On the subject of biomes, Russia is dominated by the taiga, a Russian word for boreal forest characterized by hardy conifers and in parts birch and aspen hardwoods that can withstand the very cold winters found here. Russia has more of this forest than any other country, unsurprisingly, and in total accounts for between 15 to 20% of all forests globally. In the extreme cold winters of northeastern Siberia, even conifers struggle, and it is here that we find the unique biome of seasonal boreal forest that is mostly Siberian larch, which sheds its needles in the winter. South of the taiga, we find mixed forest of mostly birch hardwoods, and south again we have some broadleaf forest in European Russia, but in general the warm to hot summers combined with relatively dry precipitation produce steppe grasslands. Okay, so that's the physical geography of Russia, but what about the human side? Russia's population is estimated at the time of this video to be about 146 million, making it the 9th most populous state in the world. About 4 in 5 people living within the country are ethnic Russian, with the remaining fraction composed of over 190 ethnic minorities, Tatars and Ukrainians being the largest of these in number. The vast majority of the country's population is in European Russia, and consequently, Russians are the largest ethnic group in Europe. The Russian language is an East Slavic language within the same family as Ukrainian and Belarusian, and mutual intelligibility exists between them. With these other languages, the Cyrillic script is used instead of Western or Latin lettering. It is named after Saint Cyril, who, with his brother Methodius in the 9th century, modified the Greek alphabet to better suit the different consonants and vowel combinations of another early Slavic language. Russian is spoken by 97% of all people in Russia, and broadly also in most of the former republics of the Soviet Union and in Mongolia. 100 other minority languages are spoken within the country, with 35 of those having official status within the various autonomous republics and regions. Regarding religion, the Eastern Orthodox Christian faith, once followed by the majority, now only composes some 40% of the population, while 25% identify as spiritual but not religious, and another 13% as atheist, and the remaining 20% being of a different faith. In terms of cities, Russia has 15 with a population over 1 million, but only 2 of these are over 2 million, and you've probably all heard of them. St. Petersburg is the second largest with an estimated population of 5.3 million. It was the capital of the Russian Empire for over 200 years and is regarded as the cultural capital of the country today, being home to many important institutions and the Hermitage Museum, the largest art gallery in the world. However, the country's capital, Moscow, is more than twice the size of St. Petersburg, with an estimated population of 12.4 million in the city proper and around 20 million in the metropolitan area, making it the largest city in Europe. As well as being the seat of government, embodied in such famous buildings as the Kremlin, Moscow is also the country's economic, industrial, and educational hub. Today, Russia's economy is the 11th largest in the world in absolute terms, or the 6th largest if local cost of living is considered, with an estimated GDP of 1.71 billion in 2021. It is regarded as a mixed economy, with significant sectors in exploitation of natural resources, manufacturing, and services. The vast geography of Russia is estimated to contain about 30% of all the world's natural resources. The oil and gas and mining sectors are very strong. Indeed, Russia has the world's largest reserves, is the leading exporter, and second largest producer of natural gas. Because of this and its also large oil reserves, it is regarded as an energy superpower. It is the largest producer of diamonds in the world, the second largest of platinum, third in gold, second in cobalt, and third in nickel. The agricultural sector is about 5% of the Russian economy by size, employing about 1/8 of the total labor force. Because of the harshness of the climate in much of the country, however, only about 8% of the land is arable, and yet despite this, Russia is still the world's largest exporter of wheat, as well as the largest producer of barley, rye, and buckwheat. Industrial production was a key tenet of the Communist five-year plans, but the manufacturing sector suffered during the 1990s as companies were forced to improve quality in order to be competitive in the new post-Soviet free market. Russia's huge and sophisticated armed forces have always been a steady buyer of the large Russian arms industry, with firearms company Kalashnikov a household name. It is one of only a handful of countries in the world that builds nuclear-powered submarines, and its missiles are among the most advanced in the world, including the new Zircon hypersonic missile, regarded by some defense commentators as rendering aircraft carriers obsolete. For aviation buffs such as myself, the Russian aerospace industry is legendary. Historically, the Soviet Union produced the world's first supersonic airliner, the Tupolev Tu-144, and the Mikoyan MiG-25 interceptor. The Russian Air Force is the only military currently flying a Mach 2 Plus bomber, that being the Tupolev Tu-160 White Swan, codenamed Blackjack, the largest aircraft ever built with a variable geometry or swing wing. In terms of civil aviation, the Soviet Union was never able to successfully export airliners to the West because of reliability and safety concerns, and in the wake of its collapse, so too did this sector, as Russian airlines favoured the more reliable and fuel-efficient models from Boeing and Airbus. In recent years, however, a revival has been underway in both aircraft and jet engine design and manufacturing for the civilian market, with the old Soviet design bureaus Tupolev, Ilyushin, Mikoyan, Yakovlev and Sukhoi being merged in 2006 to form the United Aircraft Corporation. My prediction is that airliners and jet engines built in Russia will be competing toe-to-toe with Boeing, Airbus, Rolls-Royce and General Electric in the decades to come. The Russian space industry is globally renowned through its achievements in putting the first satellite and human into orbit, as well as the longest-running national space station, Mir. When NASA's space shuttle was retired in 2011, only Russia and China had the ability to launch humans into space, and so all launches to the ISS between 2011 and 2020 were made using the Russian Space Agency Soyuz vehicle from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. Roscosmos continues to market its launch capabilities for commercial satellites on the global market. During the days of the centrally planned Soviet Union, the service industry was non-existent in free market terms as we'd think of it today. But in the past 2 decades, this sector has exploded, with information technology being perhaps the most significant. Russian speakers are the second most active language group on the internet after English. Many Western firms use Russian programmers to outsource software development, and Russian software companies such as Kaspersky have competed successfully on the global stage. The currency of Russia is the ruble, which has been in existence since the 14th century, being the currency of Imperial Russia and then as the Soviet ruble for the USSR, before being reissued again as the Russian ruble in 1991. At the time of this video, it was trading at around 75 rubles to the US dollar. Russian culture is extremely rich and globally highly influential. It has retained a distinct character while having many European influences and some lesser Asiatic ones, but at its core being something else entirely. Such is the product of its unique position across 2 continents. Traditional Russian architecture is unique in style and is found most prominently on the many churches and cathedrals topped by the distinctive onion bulb domes. St. Basil's in Red Square, Moscow is the most famous of these, and one of the most recognized landmarks in the world. European influence was deliberately embraced by Tsars such as Peter the Great, who wanted Russia to be included in the great powers of Europe, and this influence is most clearly seen in its namesake city, St. Petersburg. While Russia perhaps doesn't have fine artists as famous as those of other nations, its tradition of painting is rich and dates back to the period of the early church. Anyone who has visited a Russian Orthodox church and has seen virtually every surface covered with paintings will appreciate this. Russian painting followed much of the styles of the European artists in the following centuries, but it was during the Soviet era that perhaps it gained a unique place in the history of visual design through the extensive use of paintings for the purposes of propaganda that are unlike anything else. Russia can claim to have had as much of an impact on science and engineering globally as any nation, with many great discoveries and advancements in chemistry, physics, physiology, rocket science and aeronautics, and being globally superlative in space exploration. While Russian cuisine may not be as preeminent as other nations, it has left its mark in high society with the popularization of caviar, the eggs of fish, and in cocktail lovers and alcoholics globally with the development of distilled grain or potatoes in the form of vodka. No discussion of Russian culture would be complete without a mention of their most famous contribution to material objects, the Matryoshka dolls, more commonly known as babushka dolls in the West. Unique in concept, the outer doll is actually a hollow shell, housing another doll inside, which also houses another and another, and so on. As earlier mentioned, Russian athletes are second only to the United States in terms of Olympic achievement. In a game more cerebral than athletic, however, Russia has dominated chess over the last century or so, with more grandmasters than any other nation. Russian literature has a long tradition dating back to the earliest writings of the Kievan Rus. But it was in the golden age of Russian literature during the 19th century where Russian writers came to global prominence, and with such a rich pantheon of novelists, playwrights and poets, Russia can claim as much of an influence on literature globally as any. Later writers gained prominence in their protest of the oppression of the Soviet Union. But it's in classical music, like literature, where we find Russia leaving perhaps the greatest footprint on the global stage. And it was again during the 19th century where the golden age of Russian music shined with, in my view, more world-renowned composers of the Romantic period than any other. Not done yet, Russia had another resurgence in the 20th century with a number of composers making it to global prominence. Linked to their great achievements in classical music is the Russian preeminence in ballet. The Bolshoi Ballet is the world's most well-known dance company and has been entertaining the most eclectic of audiences since 1776. In terms of great Russians, I could of course talk about them here, but instead I thought I would share them with you to the accompaniment of one of the world's greatest composers. And that's Russia. A country like no other due to its unique geographic size and setting. Having endured perhaps a more tragic and brutal history than any European nation, its people have triumphed not merely as survivors but as a group that continues to flourish with a distinct culture that has enriched the world as much as any. This is the longest and most ambitious video I have done to date, so I hope it was all worth the work. Please like and share this video if you enjoyed it or found it useful, and please let me know your thoughts in the comments, especially if you're from this country and if I missed out anything that you feel is important. If you haven't already done so, then please click the subscribe button so you don't miss future episodes. You can also support future development of this channel by becoming a Patreon supporter for as little as $2 a month. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.